Hello, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to explore a handful of oddly gentle facts from history. Not the loud kind, not the shocking kind, just the softly strange details that people once considered completely normal. If you're listening in bed, you don't need to remember anything. You don't need to learn. You can let the facts drift in and drift out. And if you fall asleep halfway through, that's perfect. Let your shoulders drop. Let your face soften. Let your breathing slow down, just a little. We'll move through short chapters, about 5 to 10 minutes each. At the end of each chapter, I'll give you a gentle recap, a tiny closing sentence, like putting a bookmark down, without needing to return. All right, let's begin. In many European courts, especially in the early modern era, etiquette wasn't just manners. It was a language, a social map, of tiny signals. Strange part is that good etiquette often aimed for one thing: invisibility. Not literal invisibility, just social ability to exist in a room without disturbing the room. A guest could enter quietly, greet in the correct order, stand in the correct place, and speak with the correct amount of enthusiasm, which is to not too much and not too little. Too hard was suspicious, suggested ambition, suggested danger. Some courts, you were expected to perform calmness like a skill. Face was supposed to look relaxed, even if your thoughts were if your shoes were too tight, if you had no idea whether to bow first, or wait, or pretend you had already bowed earlier. Then there were the smaller rules, ridiculous now but serious then. Deep, you bowed. Long, you held eye contact. You sat before being invited. You crossed your legs. You let your hands rest in sight, or kept them still. Your body became a sentence made of punctuation. Etiquette guides cared about the angle of your head, placement of your feet, distance between you and a person of higher status. Close meant you were bold. Far meant you were cold. Correct distance meant you were trained. Training mattered, because training proved something. Proved you belonged to a world where time existed for practice. Where someone had the leisure to teach you which fork to use, which phrase to say, which tone to keep. Quietly strange when you realize etiquette often wasn't about kindness, was about recognition, a spoken with posture. In that world, the perfect guest was not the funniest one, not the most interesting one, but the one who could merge with the gracefully. Recap. Sometimes being polite meant being barely noticeable, a calm performance of invisibility. Now, let's move to weddings. Not the romantic movie kind, but the historical, contractual kind. For long stretches of European history, marriage was less like a love story, and more like a handshake between families. That sounds cold, until you remember what marriage often controlled: property, inheritance, alliances, citizenship, safety. A wedding could be a legal machine. Two households turning into one unit. Two family names combining influence, two sets of debts becoming shared. And sometimes, quietly, almost tenderly, marriage was also a form of survival. A roof, a shared winter, a way to make sure you wouldn't be alone if illness arrived, a way to make sure your children would be recognized by law. One strange detail is how often the romantic part was treated as optional, not forbidden, just secondary, like music at a ceremony. Nice to have, but not required for the paperwork to work. In some places, marriages were agreed long before the couple were even adults. Families treated it like planning, not planning a party, planning a future. And in certain contexts, the ceremony itself could be less important than the witnesses, because witnesses created public memory. They were living evidence that something had happened. The community, in a way, became the lock on the contract. If everyone saw you married, everyone would enforce it, not always gently, but effectively. And it's interesting how much of marriage used to be about visibility. You wanted the right people to know. You wanted the right people to confirm it. A marriage hidden could be challenged. A marriage witnessed became real. And here's the gentle weirdness. Love did exist. But love was often treated as something that might arrive later, like a guest who shows up after the party has already started. People hoped love would grow in the stable soil of routine. Shared meals, shared chores, a shared schedule, a shared quiet. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't, but the structure remained, because structure was the point. Today, many people want love first and paperwork later. In the past, many people wanted stability first and hoped love would grow in the stable soil. Soft recap. For many people, historically, marriage was a social and economic contract first, and romance was a maybe later addition. Let's take something smaller and cozier, formal visiting. In the 18th and 19th centuries, especially among urban middle and upper classes, you didn't just drop by, you performed a visit. People made morning calls, even if the morning call happened in the afternoon. You arrived at a socially acceptable hour, stayed a socially acceptable length of time, and left behind something like a signature, a calling card. A calling card was like a quiet little "I exist." A rectangle of paper that said, "I came. I was polite. I did not overstay." The softly strange part is how detailed this could get. You didn't just visit. You managed your visit. If the host wasn't available, you might leave a card anyway. And even that absence had meaning. It meant, I attempted. I remained connected. I did the correct thing. And sometimes the card itself could carry coded signals. If you wrote a note, it implied familiarity. If you didn't, it implied formality. If you folded a corner, it could signal a personal visit rather than a servant-delivered one. It's basically 19th century social media. A physical notification, a small artifact that said, "Seen." And here's what makes it sleepy: the strict time limits. Visits were often short by design. 15 minutes. 20 minutes. Long enough to prove respect, not long enough to become a burden. Imagine a world where overstaying wasn't a personality trait. It was a social error you were trained to avoid, and the calling card made endings easier. You could stand, smile, say something mild, and exit cleanly, leaving behind your paper self. Soft recap. Morning calls were formal short visits, and calling cards were polite proof without overstaying. Now, the dinner table. A place where humans try to look civilized while eating. The obsession with table manners in Europe and later in American high society wasn't only about cleanliness, it was about class literacy, a secret language of belonging. Some rules were practical. Don't slurp. Don't spit bones onto the floor. Don't wipe greasy hands on curtains. Yes, people used to do that. But later rules became symbolic. The correct fork, the correct glass, the correct way to butter bread. And the quietly strange truth is this: many etiquette rules are designed less to help you, and more to reveal whether you already belong. If you've ever felt nervous in a fancy place, wondering if you're holding something wrong, you've touched the old purpose of etiquette. It separates insiders from outsiders without saying it out loud. The fork becomes a test, a simple object that turns into a question. Were you trained? Do you know the script? Can you perform calmness while your brain is counting utensils? And even when nobody is judging you, your body might still behave like it's being judged. Because social training is sticky. What's funny, in a gentle way, is how arbitrary it can be. The rules are not laws of physics. They are agreements. And once enough people agree, the agreement starts to feel like nature. A spoon becomes destiny. A napkin becomes a moral statement. A small spill becomes a tiny tragedy. But in the end, we are all just animals trying to eat politely. Soft recap. Table etiquette often worked like a secret language, less about food, more about signaling, I was trained for this room. Here's one of my favorite calm weird facts, because it's about sleep itself. For many people in pre-industrial Europe, sleeping through the night in one solid block wasn't always the default. There are historical hints, diaries, writings, references, that some people talked about a first sleep and a second sleep. They'd sleep for a few hours, wake for a quiet while, then return to sleep. What did they do in the middle? Sometimes they prayed. Sometimes they read. Sometimes they talked softly. Sometimes they visited neighbors. Sometimes they simply lay there, half awake, listening to the house breathe. Imagine the night without electric light. The darkness is thicker. The house is quieter. The world feels farther away. Waking up might have felt less like failure, and more like a normal pause. Modern life trains us to expect one clean block of sleep. But bodies don't always do clean blocks. Bodies do waves. And the gentle comfort here is that wakefulness in the middle of the night has a long history. If you wake up, you might not be broken. You might be historically consistent. You might even treat that moment like a calm intermission. Not a problem to solve, just a quiet room your mind walks through before returning to bed. Soft recap. Some people historically slept in two parts, first sleep and second sleep, with a calm waking period in between. Now, let's tiptoe into a topic that's easy to make unpleasant, but we'll keep it gentle. Bathing habits in European history varied wildly by time and place. There were periods where public bathhouses were common, social, even fashionable. And there were periods where bathing became complicated by fear of disease, fear of moral judgment, fear of public spaces. When bathing was less frequent, people leaned into other strategies. Linen changes, washing hands and face, brushing hair, wiping down with cloths, and perfume, sometimes perfume. Perfume wasn't only decoration. It could be a tool, a practical solution, a way to manage the reality of human bodies in crowded cities. It's quietly strange how every era believes its own habits are obvious. We assume our routines are the natural order, but routines are just agreements with a calendar. If you go back far enough, even clean means different things. Clean might mean fresh linen. Clean might mean no visible dirt. Clean might mean a pleasant smell. Clean might mean ritual purity more than physical hygiene. History is basically a long story of humans improvising, and the improvisation smells different in every century. Soft recap. Bathing norms changed over time, and perfume often served practical purposes. Humans always improvise normal. Let's talk about superstitions, the small cozy ones. In both Europe and the United States, people have long carried little beliefs like pocket charms. Not always out of deep faith, sometimes out of habit, sometimes out of comfort, sometimes out of why not, knocking on wood, avoiding walking under ladders, carrying a lucky object, saying bless you after a sneeze. These rituals are like tiny agreements with uncertainty. They don't necessarily claim to control the world. They just give your hand something to do when you feel vulnerable. Historically, life was unpredictable. Disease, bad harvests, sudden accidents, cold winters. Risk was everywhere, and explanations were limited. A small ritual, tap the wood, say the phrase, keep the charm, could feel like a soft boundary against chaos. And even now, with science and technology, people still do it. A lucky sweater, a lucky pen, a small routine before a big event. It's not foolish, it's human. It's the mind trying to feel safe in a world that refuses to guarantee safety. Soft recap. Superstitions often function as tiny comforts, small rituals that soften uncertainty. Let's talk about superstitions, the small cozy ones. In both Europe and the United States, people have long carried little beliefs like pocket charms. Not always out of deep faith, sometimes out of habit, sometimes out of comfort, sometimes out of why not, knocking on wood, avoiding walking under ladders, carrying a lucky object, saying bless you after a sneeze. These rituals are like tiny agreements with uncertainty. They don't necessarily claim to control the world. They just give your hands something to do when you feel vulnerable. Historically, life was unpredictable. Disease, bad harvests, sudden accidents, cold winters. Risk was everywhere, and explanations were limited. A small ritual, tap the wood, say the phrase, keep the charm, could feel like a soft boundary against chaos. And even now, with science and technology, people still do it. A lucky sweater, a lucky pen, a small routine before a big event. It's not foolish, it's human. It's the mind trying to feel safe, in a world that refuses to guarantee safety. Soft recap. Superstitions often function as tiny comforts, small rituals that soften uncertainty. And that's our quiet collection for tonight. Polite invisibility, contractual weddings, calling cards, nervous forks, two-part sleep, perfume solutions, comforting superstitions, and laws that turned into fossils. If you're still awake, you can loosen your grip on the details. You don't need to hold anything tightly. Let the facts fade like a museum closing its doors for the night. 1 slow breath in and out. Good night.